We're excited to share that we have created a listener support program for the BiCurean podcast. We have a link set up where you can quickly and easily support the show. The entire process could take only as long as 60 seconds. It's glow.fm/BiCurean. That's glow.fm/BiCurean. We're asking for $5 a month, but you can contribute as much or as little as you like. If BiCurean is a part of your day or week and you love what we're doing, please visit glow.fm/BiCurean and support us any way you can today.
Welcome to the BiCurean podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is BiCurean, you ask?
While you may not necessarily have a mental concept of BiCurean, partially maybe because it's a made-up word, you embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the BiCurean moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the BiCurean.
Welcome to the show. I am Eric.
And I am Aisla.
And before we get started today, we wanted to play this promo from a close friend. They're doing a podcast audio drama, and it's a lot of fun. We invite you to check it out.
I can still hear Zoran ask.
Dice Tower Theater's Dawn of Dragons. A unique narrated audio drama based around a basement tabletop role-playing game. 6 children grow up in the dawning epicenter of a new war. 2 brothers, Benedict the pious and careful, and Zane the carefree, are joined by their younger cousin, Cordelia, the blacksmith and seamstress's daughter. Their friends, Zoran, the son of the local justice, and Sophie, the abandoned sister of a young and beautiful sword for hire, accompany them on this journey. Sword, sorcery, and adventure await to engage the listener along the way in our 20 minutes or less episodes. We hope you enjoy Dice Tower Theater's Dawn of Dragons, a proud member of the family-friendly Polygon Go network.
I'm sorry. I was just thinking.
And welcome back. So, for this week's show.
This week's show actually arose partially because Eric was looking at all the current events around the questions of impeachment, and we started talking about it. And I realized I was really confused that there's a lot of things going on in this whole process that don't make a lot of sense to me. And I'm actually someone who pays a lot of attention. And so I thought, well, I'm probably not alone then in finding this to be complicated.
I am firmly convinced that most people do not have a firm grasp of this. And I thought I did even. And then to find out, based on our research, that I was completely wrong was kind of shocking. So we thought it would be good to just take a step back and fully understand what impeachment is, the kind of the history of it, some of the ramifications of what's going on, and just discuss in general what this process is actually really all about.
Yeah, and I'm going to start with reading the section of the Constitution that outlines what impeachment is. And I also want to give an incredibly big shout out and thank you to Jessica Manor of the Body Count Pod. It's a historical podcast, and she provided a lot of support in kind of digging into all of this.
It pays to have friends who are historians.
Yeah, and generous with their time. So Constitution Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to the law. So that's the consequences. And the charges are high treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the only charges that can be brought.
Right. And so I think one of the key things that we get caught up in in discussions about impeachment are the fact that high crimes, bribery, and misdemeanors are very broad.
Right. They're not a particularly clear type of crime or infraction.
And the current situation that we're looking at, there is a lot of gray area. And you can look at how it's being defended, which is that some have said what Trump has done wasn't great, but it does not actually meet those requirements. Some have said that it's not a high crime. The entire premise of this is that it is a high crime to support yourself and your political interests above the important issues of the day for the country itself. But it's all gray. And
Right.
that's the first thing that we have to come to understand here.
And in reading some of the things that Jessica provided, as well as some other articles, there is an affirmation that the grayness, the ambiguity of it was in some ways intentional. They didn't want to so narrowly define it that future generations no longer considered those things to be infractions. They wanted it to be a broad enough infraction definition that it could meet the times. So, for example, we're still fighting Trump over him not returning over his tax returns because he's not supposed to be engaged in things that create a conflict of interest. And that's theoretically how they determine that are his investments, right?
Yeah.
And the word they use, I'm going to say it wrong, the emollients clause or whatever.
Yes, emollients clause.
Right.
That's correct.
And so what we have here in a similar fashion is this very broad definition, and it was intended to be that in order to also avoid there apparently in the British legal system or ruling system, there was a lot of political warfare. And so they wanted it to be difficult. They didn't want it to be something that was casually done. It's casually threatened. Almost every president has had some group go, I want to impeach them.
Right.
So,
We all know the term.
Yeah. So the fact that it is difficult to do is a bit of a barrier to it being something that's just casually done as a political punishment or a political act of war, right? There has to be enough momentum and enough evidence that the group feels that they can actually carry it through in some way. And while two presidents have been impeached, as in, or no, excuse me, was it two or one? Andrew Jackson, was it? Was actually found guilty, but not removed. And Nixon was likely to be found guilty, but resigned before he could be tried by the Senate. No one has been convicted by the Senate and removed.
Exactly. So that's the second half of impeachment. Impeachment technically is basically the sanction of the House of Representatives imposing a situation where the Senate would hold a trial.
Right. And interestingly, the removal of office is the punishment. And then there's a secondary punishment that can be applied, which is that they cannot hold that office but they can still hold other offices in the federal government. They're not necessarily removed from all possibilities.
Right. Meaning that if this all goes down and becomes a thing where impeachment is voted on, Senate holds a trial, they elect, which is unlikely, to remove him from office, then they would also have to make a clause to not allow him to hold that office or other offices, or else there's a chance he could actually just run for president again in 2020.
Yeah, no, and that's legit. When you brought that up to me, or maybe it was Kim, and said, I'm worried, I was like, no, that couldn't even be possible. And so I started researching it. And not only is it possible, there are a lot of people who are like, yep, that's even a likely occurrence.
That's what would happen. So, And I get it. I think there's a lot of people that I respect even and people I agree with that have latched onto this as the option to remove Trump from office. But the reality is the likelihood of this going full tilt and turning into a Senate trial where he is convicted and then removed from office is slim. So we want to actually be kind of cogent and aware of the various different things that can happen in this and not also lose sight of what the real fight is, which is to make sure one way or the other that Trump doesn't get elected again in 2020.
Right. Well, and so I'm gonna step back and just do a quick summary in our goal to kind of keep the clarity the clarity of the lack of clarification of what impeachment is. So, one, to impeach a president, the president must be found to have violated the constitutional no-nos defined clearly-ish as treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And this is where we start treading the political water, and subject to interpretation becomes the watchwords. And that's the first point of what makes this so complicated, is that ultimately one of the main differences between impeachment and other kinds of crimes is that impeachment is subject, it's a political thing, it's subject to interpretation. Whereas, like, if I steal from you, all you have to prove is ultimately that I had the ability to take something and it's gone. Most of the people involved agree for them on the general facts of, like, the call between Ukraine and Trump. They're just interpreting it differently.
Which is key here because it is open to interpretation. Again, I think the most frightening argument as far as this going forward has to come from the argument that Republicans have made that it's bad, it's not good. To quote Trump, it's not good. But that it is not necessarily an impeachable offense. And that's going to win a lot of people over, possibly even Democrats who are worried about their seat in places where them voting against Trump could hurt them in an upcoming election.
Right. And so and this, I'm going to read a little bit of what Jessica wrote for us. So she said, therefore, it becomes more about a question of political will, which I really appreciated that summary of it, and less about a direct interpretation of the rule of law, which is something that we aren't very experienced with.
Well, because we live in a world that things are interpreted as law.
Right.
And if it's a gray area, it could in theory be pushed up all the way to the Supreme Court. They make a call. We call that precedent then. It essentially makes it a law because no lower court would decide against what the Supreme Court decided, knowing full well that anyone could just push it up through appeals courts and it go to the Supreme Court. And frankly, what it comes down to is that they are unlikely to recant on what they've already said. That's how the system works now. But
Right.
This is, and this was what another thing that shocked me, a very flagrantly partisan type of event and doesn't necessarily come down to the rule of law.
Right. And furthermore, that the House doesn't just say impeached and then things go all Yul Brenner, so let it be written, so let it be done. To impeach, the House of Representatives passes the articles of impeachment, and then the Senate holds a trial to decide if the president should be removed from office or any public official, really. It doesn't have to just be the president.
Right. It's worth noting, if you want to stir up ideas about impeachment in the future, one of the offices that can be impeached is also Supreme Court justice.
Yes. And there's talk, and justices have, not Supreme Court justices, but judges have been impeached. And there's one
At lower courts.
At lower courts. And so that context, I think, is important to understand, that it's about political will and it's about interpretation. And that's part of why it can feel
bipartisan.
Inappropriately partisan.
Right.
Because that, and so in some ways, I don't obviously, we have some feelings, but about Trump. And there's this part of me that was kind of frustrated. I'm like, why can't you just admit what you're doing? Well, actually, his denial and his assertion is the politically strategic thing to do, because he's working to interpret things in the direction he wants them to go. That's what he should do if he doesn't want to lose office.
So in reality, and I think this is what hit me as troubling. This is a courtroom of public opinion where the primary public in question is Congress, and then should they create the articles of impeachment and vote on them and it passes, then it's the court of public opinion of senators. They are under no obligation, as any judge would be in a court case on any law that's printed in a book somewhere, to pass the judgment in a clear-cut fashion about this broke the law. They are basically allowed to vote with their opinion and their feelings on it.
Exactly. This is ultimately a case of persuasion and diplomacy. And one of the things that Jessica points out, and I will actually share this document, I'll share a link to it in the show notes if people want to read it. It's a really great summary. But one of the things that she points out is that the question is, will the president's party turn against the president? And can they scrape together enough Congress people to remove a character that's causing issues, or a shady character, without losing the confidence and the support of the American people? Because that's also important, right? This is a very delicate process. And it's so interesting to me because in some ways it feels like a popularity contest.
It really
in
is.
high school, you know?
Yeah, no, it really is. And I'll reiterate that the concerning thing for me here is that this is a case of the people who are in charge of making this decision are not obligated to uphold the law. And that, it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they're, in this case, actually making it, right? Like, it's the one time, and they're called lawmakers, but usually if they make laws, they
write a bill, it gets voted on, it gets implemented.
There's an input process, and this isn't how this works. And so
literally the only input that could happen, and for what this is worth, and I always recommend it if you're not writing your Congress folks, senators and House of Representatives, and telling them what you want, and canvassing your local area to get people to do it. The long story short, the only motivation that they generally have is their own opinions, the things they campaigned on, and hopefully, because we are a representative republic, hopefully they have your thoughts in mind, and they are there to represent their constituents, you, regular people, in what you believe. But beyond that, if you have a strong Republican who's your senator right now, they're likely to vote with other Republicans on this. So the influence you have is to convince your representatives to vote along the lines of what you would like to see happen. Because, yeah, this is no different than anything else. It's a popularity contest.
So when we look at a little bit of the contextual history, the first attempt to impeach a president was Johnson when he took office as vice president when Lincoln was shot. And he was in favor of a very lenient Reconstruction, which was not actually what a lot of the other Congress people wanted, or federal appointees. And he finally fired the Secretary of War that had been appointed by Lincoln, and that violated what was called the Tenure of Office Act, which was in place to make it difficult for a president to fire an appointee because they disagreed with them. He was impeached by Congress by a supermajority and went to the Senate, and they didn't remove him from office because even though they didn't really like what he was doing, didn't like that he'd fired that guy, they were like, his argument was, one, I wasn't the president that appointed him, so it doesn't apply. And two, it's not high crime, it's not treason, bribery, high crimes and it's not those things.
Right.
And they were like, yeah, I guess you're right. We don't like you, but and I do appreciate in some ways that it is difficult because, as you know, we all get partisan. We all can get stuck in a reflex, and our institutions are what keep us from becoming a mob.
Yeah.
These laws are what stand between us and sort of gladiator style elections, right?
And bear in mind, we do come at things on this show from a left point of view. I have not hidden the fact that I'm not a big fan of Trump, mostly because of some very specific things that he's done. But calling it what it is, he has still been elected by a majority of electoral votes. It wasn't the simple majority of the popular vote. It does break down that minus a couple thousand people in the other direction for every person listening to this that thinks Trump should be impeached. As of right now, the polls I've seen, there's another person in this country who thinks he shouldn't.
Yep. And it's, once again, it's that political will thing. The other thing that comes to mind for me is, in the early 90s, we had the attempt to impeach Clinton. And the two charges against him, the crimes and misdemeanors, were lying under oath about his sexual relationship with one of his interns.
Which they actually, what they called it was obstruction of justice.
And obstruction of justice. There were two. It
Right.
was the perjury and the obstruction of justice.
Right, perjury, yeah.
And so what's really been interesting to me in looking over all of this is that the Democratic Congress, or the Democratic Party, was like, why are you bugging him for these things? And that same Democratic, I want to say cabal, I don't know, something, that group today is now saying, well, definitely Kavanaugh and Trump should be held accountable for perjury and obstruction of justice, right? And it's not, and some of the same people. And similarly, the Republicans were very much about getting Clinton on those charges. And they're totally, seemingly, no big deal, Kavanaugh, no big deal, Trump, for this. And so what we've talked about before, how this idea that allowing who you like to determine what your values are and who you agree with, allowing you to determine whether or not you think someone should be held accountable, that's the danger of the partisanship. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it in this fairly recent attempt to impeach someone under very he obviously, the circumstances were different, but the charges, some of them are very similar. And the difference in how people are reacting is more to do with their party. Now, I'm sure there are some people who are actually looking at it and being thoughtful, but it is very concerning to me that values and accountability are being attached to whether or not someone's on our team or whether or not we like them, rather than on really coming up with some way of actually assessing what the situation is.
Yeah. And ultimately, assessing the situation is what this is going to come down to. And the reality is, Trump has been incredibly intelligent about this. He's in no danger right now, based on these facts, of being accused of lying because he released the transcripts. Remember, his defense here is that there's nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm. That's the best defense.
Right.
Given what we're learning about what it is, that's actually the best defense you can give.
Yeah. Trying to hide it would have maybe constituted lying, maybe would have constituted obstruction of justice. He's riding a line there by not allowing people in his offices to be subpoenaed and come. That's a line that he is starting to ride a little bit. But beyond that, this is not clear cut.
It's not. And this is a thing that I find myself constantly frustrated by in terms of how the left addresses things, because people are frequently saying, "Oh, he's an idiot." No, clearly he's not, because I don't think it's coincidence that he keeps getting out of these things when it also looks like he's not really doing the right thing. I mean, I absolutely look at that transcript and I'm like, yeah, of course he was pressuring this guy to help him.
Well, so to that point, let's actually talk about what this interpretable situation actually is, because most everybody has probably heard the term quid pro quo.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that and define that. Simplest translation from Latin is it means this for that. Now, the real issue here is that quid pro quo, in a legal sense, can be seen as bribery. There are numerous cases. I can't cite any examples, but I do recall hearing a lawyer who worked on quid pro quo cases in business dealings who was brought in on NPR at some point and confirmed things that I thought were the case, which is that essentially if a person is in a position of power to withhold something and they get some sort of favor that might not be freely offered by implying that they were withholding or going to offer something. The fact of the matter is cases like this are prosecuted legally every day, and none of them are as flagrant as somebody coming straight out and saying, if you do this thing for me, I'll give you this government contract or whatever. There's always a lot of gray area in it, but they are prosecuted on that, and they can be considered bribery. And it does seem clear-cut in regard to the fact that the details around this, such as that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, this was old news in 2016. Hunter Biden was found by people who cared about it at the time to have left before he got his hands dirty in any kind of corruption dealing on the board of Burisma. So that was widely accepted. The only reason to bring this up now would be an opportunity for Trump to slander a political opponent, and the case of whether or not he was withholding aid, which had been voted for and the check just needed to be sent to Ukraine. Like, that's how that was supposed to go down. So if he withheld it and was trying to benefit, that could be constituted as bribery. But again, this isn't going before a judge or a jury.
And it's not going before a judge or a jury that is well-versed in what quid pro quo is. I mean, they'll be, of course, briefed on all this stuff. However, it's a very different situation.
They're really not obligated, other than the ethics that we hold our elected officials to vote one way or the other.
Right.
We assume they're ethical people, or we think they're not. Whatever they act in this situation, though, is up to their personal guideposts.
Right.
So, yeah, we wanted to just take a minute and, I actually wish we had more about this, but I think it was fair to have the discussion so that people would be educated on some of these terms, and the fact that it is very likely that what impeachment looks like is not what people think it is. It's not a legal proceeding beyond the fact that it happens in our government, but it's not held to the same standard, and there is no requirement. Nobody in the Senate is going to be in any way held accountable for voting for or against it. or in Congress for voting for or against it on the basis of upholding any rule of law.
Right. I'm going to read this little summary from Jessica about it. She said there have been discussions from Hoover to Obama about impeachment, some credible and a fair few not. It is always a possibility for every American president, and we see quite clearly that impeachment is anything but clear. What constitutes treason, bribery, and high crimes or misdemeanors in the executive branch? Not perjury or obstruction. And we know that it is unconstitutional to remove a president for being a pain in the booty. All we know is that there is a precedent that it is difficult to kick out a president. Do you have to kill a man in the Oval Office, attempt to actively overthrow your own government, or is it just simply a question of political will? If the majority is against you, will a reason be found? Like licks to the center of the proverbial Tootsie Pop, the world may never know.
Something to think about. Okay, now I'm on.
Yay. Welcome to the BiCurean moment. I'm going to start us off.
Okay.
So I was driving around Denver last night, and I saw something called the Colorado Talking Book Library.
I've never heard.
Right. And at first I was just kind of wondering, like, is this a library where you're allowed to talk? Are they advertising that it's
well, you
not
say
quiet?
talking books, so my brain jumps to audiobooks.
Well, and then I was like, or is it books that talk? What's this? So of course I had to look it up at that point because I have a smarter than me phone and I can get these answers at the drop of a hat. And it's actually really cool. It's a public library for people who can't read traditional material. So in addition to audiobooks, they have Braille and large print books.
Cool.
So, and at first I found like a Yelp kind of thing, and there were all these reviews, and it was kind of really sweet and poignant things. Like, oh, my mother, her vision got bad, and then we found the Colorado Talking Book Library, and she's just so happy she can read again, or she can re-engage with the adventures. She's not as lonely. And there was just like, sort of like review after review like that about this service that a public service that's provided by the Denver Public Library for people who are disabled or have vision impairments and such.
You know, I think as we get tied up in politics and the big flashy stuff, it's often easy to forget the little ways in our community that things happen, you know, that was probably voted on, maybe city council decided. I have no idea.
Right.
But,
And it's a whole, the other thing that's kind of cool, because most libraries have a section like that,
right.
But it's an entire library dedicated to that. So that also means that folks who are dealing with those kinds of impediments to being able to read also get to like gather together. My guess is they have different kinds of programs, and because they're focused on it, they have librarians who specialize in audiobooks and Braille and large print and other accessibility materials. And so I'm like, just seems like such a great thing. Part of why I wanted to put it in the show is I want to put it in the notes. And also, whether you're here in Colorado or not, my guess is that it's probably available. That type of thing might be available in other municipalities. So if you or someone you know is struggling with something where they are no longer able to read or read the things they could before, look for this because it might be in your community. And if you're in Denver, it's definitely in your community.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
My BiCurean moment is politically oriented, and it is a short PSA, and it goes like this. There has been a lot of things in the news about ways in which Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, basically all the big social media networks, Instagram, everyone, are doing different things to potentially limit the stream of fake news, influential people coming from other countries and posing. You know, we've talked about the Russian operatives that have gone on and spoofed accounts and stuff like that. Those as far as I can see right now, measures as suggested by the heads of those companies are not in place. And we are about to enter, we're now under a year away from the 2020 election. We're entering the time when it's going to start up. I am urging everyone within the sound of my voice to please pay attention to the media that they are consuming. If it's something you feel strongly about, fact check it. It is our responsibility to repost or cite actual factual articles, not the kinds of things that just get us frothed up, that come from a website that doesn't even publish news or has no journalistic integrity. So I just want to remind everybody, it's that time of year.
Maybe remember the media bias chart and check that out. And, just remember to recognize what sources are likely to be a little bit more questionable and try to keep that up in your head. Thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or give us a call at 720-507-7309 or email podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.